There was one Lunar New Year's night that the Vietnamese people did not remember by the sound of firecrackers welcoming a new year, but by the sound of gunfire outside their doors. On the night of January 30th into the early morning of January 31st, 1968, in the middle of the Lunar New Year holiday, war suddenly entered places that seemed to have preserved one final trace of peace. Saigon trembled. Hue sank into smoke and fire. Streets lined with Tet flowers, homes with ancestral altars, children waiting for new clothes, all were suddenly pulled into one of the most controversial upheavals of the 20th century. The paradox was this: the attacking forces failed to hold most of their objectives for long. They suffered extremely heavy losses. The cities were eventually recaptured by the United States and the Republic of Vietnam. Viewed on a military map, it was not a complete victory. But after the Tet Offensive, America no longer looked at the Vietnam War with the same confidence as before. Images from Saigon, from Hue, and from the cities of South Vietnam traveled farther than any official report. They entered the living rooms of millions of American families and placed before them a chilling question. If victory was truly drawing near, why could war still erupt in the very heart of the most important places? So was the Tet Offensive a victory or a defeat? Perhaps the answer does not lie in the triumphant cheers of one side, nor entirely in the victory reports of the other. It lies in the dark space between strategy and human life, where an offensive can lose on the battlefield, yet still shake the will of a great power. By the end of 1967, in Washington, people were still trying to hold on to one belief: the war in Vietnam was moving in the right direction. On paper, the United States possessed almost everything a great power could bring to a battlefield: a modern army, overwhelming air power, helicopters, artillery, intelligence systems, vast bases, and a logistical machine capable of sustaining a war half a world away. In the reports sent home, people spoke of battles won, weapons captured, and enemy forces removed from combat. Those numbers were cold, steady, and seemed to prove one thing: with just a little more patience, victory would come. On November 21st, 1967, General William Westmoreland, commander of United States forces in Vietnam, appeared before the press in Washington. He said that the war had reached an important point where the end begins to come into view. For many Americans exhausted by war news, by death notices arriving at family homes, and by increasingly large protests in the streets, those words felt like a small light. They did not erase fear, but they helped people believe that the sacrifices had a direction, that the blood of their sons had not been shed in a distant land without meaning. In Saigon, the American command also viewed the war through the lens of a strategy of attrition. If the enemy lost more, if guerrilla forces were pushed out of their base areas, if the army of the Republic of Vietnam gradually became more stable, then time would be on America's side. But the Vietnam War did not take place only on maps hanging in conference rooms. It existed on jungle trails, in villages that seemed quiet by day but belonged to another power by night, in the anxiety of civilians who did not know who would control their hamlet tomorrow. The gap between what Washington wanted to believe and what the battlefield was quietly preparing grew wider and wider. This was not merely the error of a few reports. It was a spiritual void, where one government tried to persuade its people that there was light at the end of the tunnel, while the other side was preparing to strike directly at that very belief. Americans could see their advantage in firepower, but they struggled to see something else: the will of an enemy prepared to endure enormous losses in order to weaken America's own will. Before the Tet Offensive, America did not think of itself as weak. What made the coming offensive so shocking was that it erupted precisely when people had just been reassured that the war was nearing its end. A nation can endure loss if it believes it is moving closer to victory. But when that belief is shattered, the question is no longer how many battles have been won, but where all those victories are ultimately leading. And while Washington tried to hold on to the story that it was winning, in Hanoi, an entirely different story was being prepared. Not to strike at individual strong points one by one, but to strike at the entire will to continue the war. In Hanoi, the final months of 1967 were not merely a time of waiting for a new spring. They were a time of closed meetings, spread out maps, and calculations in which each stroke of the pen could be paid for with the lives of thousands of people. The war had gone on long enough for both sides to understand that if they simply continued fighting at the old rhythm, it could become a tug of war with no visible end. To change the situation, they had to create a blow that would cause the enemy not only to lose troops, but to lose direction. From October 20th to October 24th, 1967, the Politburo met to discuss the strategic plan for 1968. The idea being considered was no longer limited to isolated battles in the mountains, forests, or outskirts, but a coordinated offensive against the cities of South Vietnam. In that view, the city was not merely a place of bases, command organs, airfields, or radio stations. The city was where power displayed itself, where the government of the Republic of Vietnam operated, where the American presence became visible, and also where, if shaken, the whole world would be forced to look. On December 28, 1967, the Politburo held a special session and approved the strategic plan for 1968, with the policy of moving the Revolutionary War in the South into a new period, a period of offensive and uprising aimed at winning decisive victory. In January 1968, the 14th Conference of the Third Central Committee of the party adopted that policy through a resolution carrying a forceful spirit, to advance heroically to carry out a general offensive and general uprising. Behind those political lines was a great gamble. Hanoi and the communist forces in the South did not merely want to strike at enemy soldiers. They wanted to strike at the sense of security in the cities, to strike at the administrative machinery, to strike at the media, and to strike at the psychology of Americans watching the war through television screens. If Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and Can Tho all shook during Tet, the message sent out would go far beyond the gunfire on each street. The war had not been brought under control, and nowhere was truly beyond reach. But every grand strategy carries within it a fragile assumption. The general offensive was expected to go together with a general uprising. The cities would be awakened by gunfire, but would the people rise up as predicted? Those living between two lines of fire, already exhausted by war, were they ready to turn fear into political action? This is what makes the Tet Offensive such a complex story. It was both an expression of bold will and a place where estimates about the people's sentiment, the battlefield situation, and human endurance were tested with brutal severity. In closed rooms in Hanoi, the plan was formed as a strike at the future of the war. Meanwhile, in the South, many families were still preparing incense, flowers, fruit, cakes, and new clothes for the first day of the year, unaware that the coming spring would not enter history through the sound of celebratory firecrackers, but through the gunfire that opened one of the longest nights of the Vietnam War. There is something very strange in the memory of war. Sometimes history does not enter a person's life through the sound of artillery from far away, but through a noise very close, right outside the door. For many families in South Vietnam at the beginning of 1968, that moment came during Tet, when the ancestral altar had been cleaned, incense had been lit, children were waiting for new clothes, and adults tried to believe that although war was still there, the first few days of the year might still preserve a fragile trace of peace. The first attacks broke out on the night of January 30th, 1968, in several localities, and then, in the early morning of January 31st, the wave of attacks spread across many cities and bases in the South. The quiet of Tet was torn apart by gunfire, explosions, warning sirens, and the sound of helicopters circling in the sky. From places once considered relatively safe rear areas, civilians were stunned to realize that war was no longer far away. It had entered the streets, passed under the eaves, through markets, schools, and homes still filled with the scent of Tet incense. The scale of the blow shook all of South Vietnam. According to official Vietnamese sources, the attacking forces struck 4 of the 6 major cities, 37 of the 44 provincial towns, along with many towns, district capitals, military bases, and command centers. Names began to appear on the map of war: Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, Can Tho, Nha Trang, Buon Ma Thuot, Tan Son Nhut. Each place was no longer a point on a map, but but a community of people waking in panic, not knowing whether the gunfire before them signaled a long occupation, a fierce counterattack, or a flight so urgent that they could bring nothing with them. What shocked people was not only the number of targets attacked, but the way the war appeared at the same time in so many places. It was a blow designed to make people feel that there was no longer a clear boundary between front line and rear area. An airfield could become a battlefield. A radio station could become a target. A familiar street could turn into a place of combat. A family celebrating Tet could, within only a few minutes, have to choose between staying, fleeing, or lying still on the floor and waiting for the gunfire to pass. For the United States and the Republic of Vietnam, this was a major shock in perception. It was not that there had been no warning signs at all. Intelligence had recorded many unusual movements, many indications of enemy preparation. But there is a vast distance between seeing scattered fragments and correctly understanding the whole picture. War does not always hide everything. Sometimes it leaves behind a few traces, but human beings fail to assemble them into a timely warning. That night, the gunfire did not merely open a campaign. It shattered the feeling that war could still be localized, measured, and controlled through reports and maps. From this point on, the story would no longer remain within general numbers. It would appear through each symbol struck directly at the heart, and nowhere stunned the world more than Saigon, where only a few hours of fighting were enough to shake the image of American power in Vietnam. Saigon in the early morning of January 31st, 1968, was no longer a city of late Tet lights. It became a grand stage of history, where every place attacked carried meaning far beyond ordinary military value. Independence Palace, the radio station, the Joint General Staff of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and especially the Embassy of the United States, all appeared as symbols of an order that the communist side wanted to shake before the eyes of the world. Among them, the attack on the Embassy of the United States caused the greatest shock. A Viet Cong sapper team penetrated the embassy compound in the first hours of the morning. They did not seize the main building. They did not turn the place into a long-term base. After more than 6 hours of fighting, the sapper team failed to capture the main building. Those who entered the embassy compound were all put out of action, most of them killed, while the survivors were captured. Judged purely by military measures, it was a raid that failed to achieve a major tactical objective. But war does not live only on operational maps. It also lives in images, in the mind, in the sudden questions that arise among people watching the news on the other side of the Pacific. The embassy was not a remote outpost. It was the symbol of America in South Vietnam, a modern concrete structure, heavily guarded, standing in the center of Saigon. When news spread that even this place had been attacked, many Americans did not hear the story in the language of tactics. They did not ask whether the attacking force had held its objective. They asked a simpler question, but one far more dangerous for Washington, if even the very heart of the American presence in Saigon could be struck. Could the claims that the war was under control still be trusted? That was the moment when symbolic value rose above military result. A breached wall, an infiltrated compound, several hours of fighting in the heart of the capital of the Republic of Vietnam. Each detail was carried by the international media as evidence that the war had not been pushed back into the forests or remote areas. It still had enough force to enter the center of the city, enough force to touch the place Americans had believed to be safest, enough force to turn the confidence of a great power into a feeling of insecurity. For the people of Saigon, that event was not only an American matter. Their city was awakened by gunfire, amid familiar streets that suddenly became strange. Some saw soldiers running past their doors. Some heard helicopters flying low over their roofs. Some could only hold their children close and lie flat against the tile floor, waiting for one burst of gunfire to end without knowing whether it would be followed by silence or another explosion. History, in that moment, was no longer something written in books. It was the held breath of families who had not yet finished a single New Year's meal. Saigon did not ultimately fall during the Tet Offensive. The attack targets were gradually brought back under control. But what had been struck was not easy to restore. the belief that the United States and the Republic of Vietnam could guarantee security in the most important places. From a cold perspective, it was an attack that had been repelled. From the perspective of the media and the psychology of war, it was a major crack in the wall of confidence that Washington had tried to build during the many months before. Saigon showed the world the power of symbols in war. But to fully understand the human cost of the Tet Offensive, the story must move beyond buildings of power to an ancient city where the gunfire did not last only a few hours, but left a wound that many generations still cannot fully name: Hue. If Saigon stunned the world because symbols of power were struck directly in the center, Hue made history fall silent for another reason. This was not merely a city. Hue was the former imperial capital, home to the imperial city, the perfume river, solemn old houses, and streets long accustomed to the sound of temple bells, prayers, and morning vendors' calls. In Vietnamese memory, Hue carries the gentle grace of culture and ritual. That is why, when war poured into this place, the pain did not lie only in the fact that a city had been attacked, but in the feeling that part of the nation's soul had been dragged into fire and bullets. In the early morning of January 31st, 1968, forces of the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong attacked Hue. Many areas of the city quickly fell into the hands of the attacking forces, while several key positions of the Republic of Vietnam still managed to hold out, including the headquarters area of the 1st Infantry Division at Mang Ca. From that moment on, Hue was no longer just a point on an operational map. It became a brutal urban battle, where every street, every wall, every city gate could turn into a defensive line. The battle in Hue lasted nearly a month. For soldiers, those were days of fighting house by house, block by block, courtyard by courtyard. For civilians, they were days of not knowing whom they would meet when their door opened, not knowing whether a detained loved one would ever return, not knowing whether an explosion in the distance signaled rescue or a new danger drawing near. Some families no longer thought about victory or defeat. They only hoped to survive one more night, find one person, protect one child, bury one loved one without another burst of gunfire, cutting the moment short. Hue was also where the story of the Tet Offensive became most painful because of civilian memory. After the fighting ended, many mass graves were discovered in and around the city. American and Republic of Vietnam sources, many witnesses, and a number of research works recorded arrests, executions, and disappearances during the period when communist forces controlled parts of Hue. Official Vietnamese accounts, while emphasizing the strategic significance of the general offensive, often focus on the destruction caused by American and Republic of Vietnam firepower during the effort to retake the city. For that reason, Hue is not merely a battle. Hue is a contested field of memory, where each side preserves its own way of telling the story, while civilians carry losses that cannot easily be contained within any single report. What must be said about Hue must be said with caution. This city cannot be turned into a slogan. The suffering of the dead cannot be used to deepen the victory narrative of one side or the other. Beneath the language of the military, captured, recaptured, casualties, counterattack, were human lives cut short during a Lunar New Year season. Some died from artillery fire. Some disappeared after being taken away. Some survived, but carried fear through the rest of their lives. History may debate the numbers. Families remember by names. Militarily, Hue was eventually retaken by the forces of the Republic of Vietnam and the United States. Politically, the Battle of Hue became part of the great shock that the Tet Offensive caused in American public opinion. But in human terms, Hue cannot simply be called victory or defeat. An ancient city was torn apart for nearly a month. Roofs collapsed. Tet altars became mourning altars. Streets once meant for unhurried footsteps suddenly became places where people bent low to avoid bullets. There, war was no longer the strategy of leaders, but a cold hand placed upon each family. Hue forces the viewer to slow down. After Saigon, people understood the power of symbols. After Hue, they understood the price of those symbols when paid for with civilian blood and bone. And when images from Saigon, Hue, and many other fronts crossed the ocean into American living rooms, the war no longer took place only in Vietnam. It began to take place inside America itself, on television screens, in the silent questions of families asking themselves, in the end, where are we still heading? After the Tet Offensive, the Vietnam War was no longer seen only through operational maps or military bulletins. It entered the living rooms of millions of American families through black and white television screens, during dinner, among silent children and parents trying to understand why their sons still had to be in such a distant place. Before that, many Americans had already doubted. After Tet, that doubt had images, sounds, and the face of a reporter standing amid ruins, saying that things were not as the reassurances from Washington had claimed. On February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite, the famous anchor of CBS News, broadcast a special program after his trip to Vietnam to observe the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Cronkite was not an anti-war activist in the familiar sense. He was a television figure trusted by a great many Americans, a calm and familiar voice that seemed to enter every household at the end of the day. That is why, when he concluded that the war appeared to be mired in stalemate and that the most reasonable path was negotiation, his words did not sound like a chant in the streets. They sounded like a slow confession from the very center of American trust. What matters is not that Cronkite alone changed America's mind. History rarely changes direction because of a single sentence. Before him, there had already been rising casualties, protests, soldiers returning with weary eyes, families receiving death notices, senators beginning to question the war, and advisors within the Johnson administration quietly growing doubtful. But Cronkite did something that statistics could not do. He gave a name to the feeling growing inside the public. The feeling that America might be very powerful, but that its power could no longer answer the simplest question: when will this war end? From that point onward, the battlefield within America became more intense. On television, people saw Saigon attacked, Hue in ruins, American soldiers fighting in city had once been told were under control. In real life, they saw casualty numbers rising, the war budget expanding, society divided within universities, churches, and family dinners. A father might support the government, while his son marched in the streets against the war. A mother might hang a flag on the front porch, yet still be unable to sleep for fear that a soldier would knock on the door bringing terrible news. On March 31, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered a televised address to the nation, announcing a restriction on the bombing of North Vietnam and calling for a process of negotiation. At the end of the speech, he stunned America when he said that he would not seek and would not accept his party's nomination for another presidential term. It was not a moment in which the Tet Offensive alone ended Johnson's political career. But certainly, after Tet, he could no longer speak to America with the same confident voice as before. From here, the question of the Tet Offensive no longer fits neatly within the battles that were won or lost. It moves to a deeper level. If a campaign does not fully achieve its military objectives, but causes the enemy to lose faith in its ability to continue the war, should history call that defeat or victory? To answer, we must step into the most difficult part of the story, placing the Tet Offensive on 3 scales at once: military, political, and human memory. At this point, the original question returns, but it is no longer as simple as it was at the beginning. Was the Tet Offensive a victory or a defeat? To answer too quickly would be to turn history into a scale too small for what it must carry: the lives, beliefs, strategies, and memories of millions of people. Some events cannot be placed into a single box. The Tet Offensive is one of them. The closer we look, the more the answer separates into many layers. On the scale of direct military results, the attacking side did not achieve many of its key objectives as expected. Most of the places seized in the first days were gradually retaken by the United States and the Republic of Vietnam. Saigon did not collapse. The government of the Republic of Vietnam did not disintegrate. A broad urban uprising, if it was part of the strategic calculation, did not unfold as hoped. Communist forces suffered heavy losses, especially after the first wave, when the element of surprise had passed and the enemy organized stronger counterattacks. Even some later official Vietnamese sources acknowledged that in the following waves, the attacking forces faced many difficulties and losses. and that there had been subjective elements in their assessment of the situation. Viewed from that angle, the Tet Offensive was not a military victory in the sense of holding cities or immediately bringing down the enemy's apparatus. It was a bold strike that created great surprise, but it came at a very high cost. On the battlefield, courage does not automatically become victory. A plan may be prepared with powerful will, but once it enters the city, into each street, each block, each reaction of the population, and each counterattack by the enemy, it is forced to confront a reality colder than any slogan. On the political and psychological scale, the story changes color. The Tet Offensive did what many earlier battles had not been able to do. It caused the American public to doubt, at the root, the claim that the war was nearing its end. Washington could say that the enemy had failed militarily. Generals could point out that key objectives had been retaken. But after what appeared on television and in the press, the question inside America could no longer be easily erased. If victory was drawing near, why could the war still erupt with such force? After the Tet Offensive, America entered a different stage of the war. Not because the United States military had lost its ability to fight, not because the Republic of Vietnam was immediately defeated, but because the confidence of the public, the press, the political class, and even the policymakers themselves began to crack more deeply. War does not need only guns and bullets in order to continue. It needs a story strong enough to convince the people that sacrifice still has meaning. When that story begins to shake, military superiority also becomes isolated. On the scale of human memory, every judgment of victory or defeat becomes heavy. For soldiers from the North and communist forces in the South, the Tet Offensive may be remembered as a turning point full of sacrifice, a blow that shook the enemy and opened the way for strategic change. For soldiers of the Republic of Vietnam and their American allies, it may be proof that they stood firm, counterattacked, and held the cities at a dangerous moment. For many civilians, especially in Hue and the cities swept into the fighting, it was the Tet season of disappearances, ruins, mourning clothes, and questions that would never be fully answered. For that reason, perhaps the fairest answer is this. The Tet Offensive was a short-term military failure for the attacking side, but a long-term political and psychological victory in the war to erode the will of the United States. At the same time, it was a great tragedy for the civilians of South Vietnam. One side could lose a great deal on the battlefield, yet still cause the other side to lose even more in confidence. One side could keep the cities, yet no longer preserve the world's belief that it was in control of the war. History sometimes does not ask who won through cheers of triumph. It asks through the silence after the smoke of battle. It asks in military reports, in political meeting rooms, in homes that have lost loved ones, in cities that were retaken but no longer whole. And when all these layers of meaning are placed on top of one another, the Tet Offensive is no longer a neat answer. It becomes a reminder that some battles do not decide the fate of a nation in a single day, but they change the way the whole world understands that war. From the question of victory or defeat, we are only one step away from the hardest thing to say. In the end, when the gunfire falls silent, what does history leave behind in the hearts of those who lived through that Tet season? The Tet Offensive did not bring the Vietnam War to a close. After that spring, bombs and bullets still continued, armies still marched, families still sent their sons to the front, and negotiations still dragged on beneath the cold lights of diplomacy. But one thing had changed very deeply. After the Tet Offensive, people no longer looked at the war with the same belief as before. What happened in Saigon, in Hue, and in the cities of South Vietnam left a crack in the story each side told about itself. For strategists, the Tet Offensive was a problem of military power, psychology, and politics. For historians, it was a complex turning point where defeat and victory did not stand separately, but overlapped like layers of smoke after a battle. For the people who lived through that Tet season, history did not appear as a concept. It appeared as a house without a roof, a loved one who did not return, an altar that had just welcomed the new year, and then had to be covered with mourning cloth. Perhaps that is why the question, was the Tet Offensive a victory or a defeat, should never be answered too easily. If we look only from the side that won on the political front, we may forget the lives crushed beneath events. If we look only from the side that held the defensive lines, we may fail to see the weight of a blow that shook the very will to continue the war. If we look only from the pain of civilians, we will understand that some victories in history still carry the sound of weeping for a very long time. In the end, the Tet Offensive reminds humanity that in war, some battles do not immediately decide borders, but they decide belief. Some cities are retaken, yet never return whole in memory. Some soldiers survive, yet carry for the rest of their lives a New Year's Eve without the sound of celebratory firecrackers. And some families, many years later, still do not ask who won or who lost. They only ask why that spring took so much from them. History does not lie still inside a single answer. It remains in wounds, in declassified documents, in conflicting memoirs, in the trembling words of witnesses, and in the silence of those who never had the chance to tell their story. For that reason, the Tet Offensive is not only an event of the Vietnam War, it is a warning about the cost of every war when belief, power, and human life are placed together on the same chessboard. Before moving on to the secret wars, the peace negotiations, and the day a city collapsed beneath the sound of the final helicopters, let us pause in the spring of 1968. Because the Tet Offensive does not only raise the question of who won and who lost, it also forces us to look at the price human beings must pay when history is written with gunfire, belief, and silence. When looking back at the Tet Offensive, the hardest thing is not to choose one side and call it victorious and another side and call it defeated. The hardest thing is to have enough courage to see everything. The soldier who fell because he believed he was following an ideal, the soldier who stood his ground in the city because he believed he was defending his homeland, the mother who lost her child without needing to know which way the military map tilted, and the families who, after many years, still only long for an answer about a loved one who never came home. History is often written with dates, resolutions, campaigns, and the names of generals. But human memory is preserved by things much smaller. An unfinished Tet meal, a door that could not be closed in time, an altar turning from the incense of spring to the incense of morning, a city after fire and smoke, no longer able to recognize itself. The Tet Offensive does not force us to answer too quickly who won and who lost. It forces us to pause longer before the cost of every war, because there are victories that make even the victors fall silent. There are defeats that change the direction of history, and there are losses that belong to no side, because they belong to human beings. Atlas of the Past retells this story not to reopen hatred, nor to stamp history with a simple verdict. We retell it so that what was once buried beneath gun smoke, beneath slogans, beneath the silence of time, may still have one chance to be heard. Because in the end, the past never truly disappears. It remains there in cities that have been rebuilt, in families that have learned how to keep living, in documents opened after many decades, and in the question each generation must answer for itself. When a war ends, who is truly left in peace?